Hello everyone, thanks for joining us so promptly for the webinar Behavioural Change for Sustainability Success. We might kick off now and more people can join as I go through the housekeeping. So just a few points. We are Toitū Envirocare, New Zealand's leading environmental certification organisation, and our experts Sophia White of Toitū and Thea Knight of PwC will be leading the webinar today. But first, my name is Bronwyn and I'm just covering a few housekeeping things before Sophia and Thea go into their sessions. So first, you are all on mute. If you have any problems with sound or visuals, I recommend that you check your computer or headset settings. If that doesn't fix it, then try closing the webinar window and rejoining. That usually fixes most problems. You can use the chat function to interact, just as you probably have in previous webinars, and the Q&A function to propose any questions to our experts, because there will be a Q&A session towards the end of the webinar. We'll be recording the session and I will follow up with you all with an email in the next couple of days with the survey and also a link to the recording and the slides. So really would appreciate your time if you're able to fill out the survey, as it helps us to ensure we're focusing on the right problems. And so if you have any technical issues in the meantime, please also feel free to send me as the host a direct chat. Otherwise, without further ado, I will hand it over to Sophia to start to get into the meat of the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Bronwyn. Can everyone hear me okay? Thumbs up. Yep, okay, awesome. Kia ora, and thank you for joining us for this webinar today, Behavioural Change for Sustainability Success. My name is Sophia White. I'm a Sustainability Advisor for Toitū Envirocare, and I'm really lucky to have with me today Thea Knight. Thea, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Lovely, thanks so much. So I'm part of the dedicated behavioural science team we have over at PwC, and I trained up a number of years ago now after doing a master's in behavioural economics, and have really been practically applying behavioural science in a number of different scenarios. And today I'm going to be including a lot of examples really specific to sustainability internally, and be sharing some case studies around that. So that's a quick intro to me. Back over to you.
Thanks, Thea. So before we dive into that, I'm just going to do a quick refresh on the SDGs and why they're important for business. So these are the 17 goals to change our world, transform our world, as part of the 2030 global agenda for sustainable development. Beneath these 17 goals are 169 targets, and they are a call to action for all sectors, all aspects of society. This is the wedding cake model. And I really like this model because it shows how the economy is nested in society, which is nested in our environment. And the common thread throughout is that goal 17, partnerships for the goals. I think this really highlights how interconnected and integrated and holistic the 17 goals are, which is really fundamental and part of their design. The UN have emphasised the role of business and being a force for good in achieving these goals. And that's really what I'm passionate about, in enabling business to achieve sustainable development. Bronwyn, are you able to do the poll? So before we get started, I'd just like to do a quick poll. If you could answer, how is your organisation performing on its sustainability journey? Awesome, it's popped up. This is the first time we've tried the poll function, so this is the first time we tried it. So yeah, I'll give you a minute to answer. If you could just assess how your organisation is performing, aligned to one of these answers. It doesn't cover everything. And then we'll have a look at the answers. How are the votes going, Bronwyn? Have we got enough answers in yet?
Yeah, really great. We've got about 77% of people have voted. So it looks like
awesome.
Most are saying that their organisation has identified key areas of focus for sustainability and set up initiatives. So it's about half. And then the rest of that is equally made up of between my organisation has integrated sustainability into the strategy, and around 27% says my organisation talk about sustainability but don't have a clear approach, and only a very small number say that their organisation don't consider sustainability at all.
Okay, that's really interesting. It's nice to see quite a spread, and nice to see that there's a significant amount that have already integrated sustainability into business strategy. So I'll go into the next slide. Connecting business and sustainable development. What is the role of business in global sustainable development? Of course, it's not the responsibility of one single business to achieve global sustainable development, but it's the responsibility of the business to operate in a way that does no harm, and preferably has a positive impact by providing decent work, managing its emissions, its waste, and making sure that its products and services actually contribute towards a sustainable future. And that's the role of corporate social responsibility. It's a mechanism through which business is a force for good that contributes towards sustainable development. A key thing about corporate social responsibility is that a business can only take responsibility for the impacts and challenges that it has on the groups impacted by its activities and its business. And so to do that, stakeholder engagement is really important to identify what those aspects are. There are 17 goals. So if an organisation says all 17 goals are important, they're essentially saying that none are important. And that's why materiality assessments, especially ones done with stakeholders, are really important to identify what those priority areas are. Businesses only have limited resources and a limited sphere of influence and control through which it can have the greatest impact. In a previous webinar, I talked about how you can use materiality assessments to prioritise the sustainability aspects most important to your business and align these to the SDGs. And that webinar is available on our website. It's called Supercharge Your Sustainability Strategy. And in that webinar, we had 2 case studies, one from Wellington Zoo and another from the Auckland District Health Board. And following that webinar, after there was a lot of interest in the health sector, and so we worked with the Auckland District Health Board to do a special webinar on the health sector, and that's also available online. But those webinars were done in a pre-COVID time, and now the world has very much changed, and I feel quite lucky to be in New Zealand and be able to use the phrase post-COVID, because for many worldwide, COVID-19 is still a daily battle. I am feeling really hopeful though, because there are calls worldwide to build back better, to not go back to business as usual. And there's a growing number of articles and thought pieces online to champion the Sustainable Development Goals as that framework through which we should build back better. We should be building back to achieve these goals. And you'll hear time and time again that the decade 2020 is our decade of action, because not only do we have 10 years to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, but we have that very urgent matter of climate change, the irreversible climate change being locked in by the year 2030 if we don't reduce our emissions by at least, I think, 40% from the 2010 baseline. So the lockdown period has resulted in a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, and many are kind of celebrating that, but as an environmentalist, this was not the just transition that we're talking about when we talk about systematic change. I don't know if anybody else has seen the year 2040. I have. I was so inspired by it and I loved it. And I think it showed the world that we know is possible through initiatives, through projects, through ideas that are around today. But how do we get from the graph that we have there, which shows that if we don't make systematic changes, we will just continue on that upward trajectory? How do we get from that trajectory to the goal of a carbon neutral future with all these fantastic ideas? So my final poll, thinking about your organisation, what is the #1 barrier you face, your organisation faces in its transition towards sustainability? Whether that's, it's at the start of its sustainability journey, you're just looking at getting a case study, whether it's through sustainability initiatives that you don't think are having the biggest impact they can, whether it's communication, people aren't buying into it, or if you just feel like overall the company doesn't have the right skills and knowledge yet. If you could choose an answer, and then we'll look at the answers with Bronwyn again.
Just give it another minute or so, Sophia. We've got about half the people have voted, so obviously having a little bit of a think. Okay, it looks like we've had a good amount of people have a chance to vote, and I'll just share those results. So hopefully you can see that.
Awesome. That's like a really good spread of different barriers and challenges that businesses are faces. And this can often relate to the stage or like the level of maturity an organisation is in its sustainability journey. Can you close the poll, please, Bronwyn? Oh, I can do it myself. Okay, it was just on my screen. So I'm really excited today because we got Thea with us, and Thea's going to teach us a key tool for our sustainability toolkit. As champions of sustainability, it's so important that we have tools and resources that we can use to actually make meaningful impact in our businesses. And behavioural change techniques is a vital tool for actually making lasting impact. So I feel really lucky that we're going to be learning from Thea today. So, oh God, there we go. I'd just like to remind everyone that if you are looking for further support in your sustainability journey, or just want to talk about different challenges and things that you're facing, feel free to get in touch. My contact details are on the screen, as are Sean O'Flaherty's, our sales manager. So without further ado, thank you so much for listening to me, and I'm going to hand over to Thea.
Lovely, thanks so much. That's great. I think, can people see me, Bronwyn? Lovely, perfect. So as I mentioned, I'm from a dedicated behavioural science or behavioural economics team, and we're really focused on how can we take particular kind of strategies and values and turn them into really specific change. And a key insight from behavioural science is we really want to understand what is the specific thing that we want somebody to do differently, and how can we use an understanding of how people use their brain and make decisions in order to really encourage them to make that change. And it's often about making small changes to things you might already have underway, or it's about applying kind of a change to the context of how a person makes a decision. So often I think if you've got a background in communications, and I do myself and worked in that sphere a long time, is sometimes the focus can be on how can we just kind of share more information and really focus on education. And actually, you know, that is important, but it absolutely isn't all of the pieces of the pie. We also need to understand that people might understand our message or have awareness of it, but that won't always necessarily translate into change. So today I'm going to talk about kind of what is behavioural science. So we've got a clear kind of agreement on the terms I'm using and the kind of premise of what behavioural science refers to. We're going to talk about some of the insights into how people make decisions, and specifically some really relevant ones to the sustainability sector. And I worked in this space, I think, since about 2008, 2009. So I've seen the same kind of challenges come up again and again. And then we'll run through some specific case studies that you may be able to replicate yourself or replicate parts of. So I'll now kind of share my screen and talk you through some slides that I've developed. Can everyone see my screen? Lovely, that's great. So to start with, what am I talking about when I use the term kind of behavioural science? The first thing to reference is ultimately a key understanding is that we're not always as rational as we'd like to necessarily think that we are. There's a great quote here from Rory Sutherland, who I think of as a bit of a modern day philosopher, and he is a very well-known person working in the behavioural science sphere. And he talks about the human mind does not run on logic any more than a horse runs on petrol. And typically his argument is if the answer was logical, someone would have had it already. They would have found it. And therefore recognizing that we don't always necessarily think everything through and read all the information available and consider critically every decision that we make in our day, we need to critically kind of recognize that when we're designing things that are going to change what people do. And it's no criticism, it's just purely kind of the way that we're built. And the core understanding behind that is that we have two systems of thinking. So there's a famous book out there by Daniel Kahneman, and I really recommend you looking him up, and he's won a Nobel Prize for some of his thinking in this area. And he really talks about the two systems of brain. where one is really rational and thinks things through and has that slow kind of processing. But then our system one part of our brain, the system one, is really reactive, instinctive. And the difficulty is that the difference between these two parts of our brain is our system two brain deals with about 40 bits of information per second, whereas our system one brain deals with about 11 million bits of information per second. So what you've got there is just a lot of the times there's a difference between what we kind of rationally might really consider and think through, and sometimes there's in effect some kind of unconscious drivers of our behaviour. And what we're doing in behavioural science is designing for those and preparing for those and recognising them. So I've got here a nice kind of summary of what I think that the core kind of beats of this kind of thinking and understanding is that often within the sustainability area, we really want people to do something differently. You know, we don't want them to drive to work. We would prefer if they in their work didn't use unnecessary energy, for example. But the thing is, most people know that this is an issue. Absolutely, I would argue the problem is not education and awareness. But the thing is, they still don't change. So there has to be other things that we need to, other levers that we need to pull in order to really ensure that we achieve that change. And here within this area of behavioural science, what we're doing is bringing in insights from economics, psychology, and neuroscience to really help understand some of those hidden drivers as I've described. And I want you to be reassured that when I'm talking about this area, and I don't want to assume that people on the call absolutely don't know about it, you might be already quite familiar, which is great. But for those who aren't, this is just being used everywhere around the world. It's a really well-used specialism with proven methodologies. So it's a really interesting specialism in the sense that a lot of the insights and original studies were developed in the public sector, and then the private sector kind of caught on to all of the results that were being developed in the public sector, and these have now been spread across the globe. So to show you the expanse and kind of impact of behavioural economics and behavioural science, on Friday there's an event, one of the kind of premier events called Nudge Stock, and it's free, and I recommend you attend if you're available. You can look it up. There are 20,000 people attending that event. And for something such as this, which is really quite specific about designing for people and how they change, it's great to see that kind of interest in the event. And we just know that there are dedicated behavioural science people in academia and in the public sector, just thousands of teams. So you're definitely not alone if you look to use some of these specific methodologies. So when we're thinking about what the actual challenge is here, and it's obviously I'm talking quite high level within the sustainability sector, I think it's useful to think about some of the critical kind of behavioural insights and challenges. And at the crux of it here, what we're dealing with is an intention action gap. So this is when I'm talking about the fact that people understand and they actually have just the best of intentions. I'm sure if you did a poll in New Zealand, I'm sure there's lots of them out there, that I'm sure like 90% of people would be like, yes, I absolutely need to improve my behaviour in order to look after the environment and the emissions in the air. But then there's a whole lot of background thinking that leads to the fact there's a big gap between what they might think and what they actually do. And it's the same equivalence of, I know I really need to eat healthy, but if I've had a long day at work, I come home, I sit on the couch, you know what, I just want to eat pizza. I'm just going to order a pizza. I'm tired, I don't have any time. And I might really understand the need not to eat pizza, but I'm bloody well calling pizza. And so what we really need to understand is there's a lot of techniques just to overcome this gap. And it can be as simple as, reducing the friction, increasing the ease to ensure that what we're encouraging people to do is super easy. Changing the context so people don't even necessarily have to make the decision in the first place, in order to, design something that means that people are just by default using what is the desired behaviour. And even kind of reminding people at the moment of the decision what their values are. So for example, I've been in organisations where we've put pictures of the sea covered in plastic right next to the disposable cups, and where there's a choice between a disposable cup and reusable cup. They see the impact of their decision is a whole lot of plastic in the sea. So it's just small techniques like that that you might use to overcome that. And critical to understanding that is that we're really focused on the present. Our brain doesn't necessarily as easily find a connection to what I do now and the impact on the future. I care less about future Thea. I'm super focused on now Thea. And that just means that when you're trying to translate benefits where possible, you want to try and make them feel salient or, real in the moment, because in a sense, we just think that the future version of ourselves will be better and do a better job, and for example. And it's just something that we are kind of an innate tendency. And the last kind of key insight that I'm going to share is about the need kind of furthering that idea of making things real, and where possible, making it the content super personalized and super local. And I'm sure that won't be any news to anyone on the call who's focused on communicating sustainability. So there's been a number of studies that have shown people are much more likely to engage with sustainable behavior change if the effects of what they're doing are seen to be local or personal to them. So any gamification techniques, for example, are focused on me getting feedback about my specific behavior, and that means that I can be invested in my specific progress. And there's a nice study that I'm showing on the slide there that talks about a study in British Columbia where they saw much more engagement with sustainable content and an intention to act in a positive pro-environmental way, based on all of the messages being focused on the impact to their local region versus, say, a global carbon emissions number reduction. So when I'm talking about these insights, it's maybe useful to kind of embed them in actually what the process is. And this is something you can maybe start to think about when you've got one of your values or your CSR kind of strategies out there, is looking and thinking about it through this lens. And there's a number of tools out there that are available, and of course we're available here to support, but you can look at teams such as the Behavioural Insights team, who have got a really useful kind of descriptions and further explanation of these different types of steps. So the first is really being clear on what you want people to do. Often we might talk about awareness or things that can be seen as a bit more vague, I'd say. So here we're really focused on what is the specific thing you want someone to do and where and when. So I want employees to not drive to work 3 days a week, for example, to make sure that anything you're designing is really specific to that audience and to that location and to that group and to that action. Then you want to understand what is it that's actually stopping them doing it. So I think one thing I continue to see again and again is we go, well, employees should do this because it's important. They just won't unless we make it easier for them to do it. And I think we have to recognize that everyone is super busy and there's lots of pressure on everyone and there's a lot of shoulds. So the only way you're going to cut through is if you recognize what are the things that are really going to stop this person from doing the thing that I'm encouraging them to do. Is their manager actually telling them it's important? Is there a lot of kind of process and structural barriers? Is this person going to have the time? How can I free up some time? And that helps us really design something that's just much more likely to be successful. The third thing is really designing with an understanding of how somebody makes decisions. So you can use a lot of insights and a lot of techniques from behavioural science, some of which I'm going to talk about shortly, when you're designing specifically the thing that you want to do differently. And then the fourth thing, and this is where absolutely behavioural science shines, is testing and preferably creating a control and a treatment. So you can actually see the difference between those, what your kind of current state would typically be, and actually by changing this one thing, you can see an impact specifically by changing that thing. So what we call a control and a treatment. And what's super valuable for you, I think, if you're looking to gain momentum, and if one of the key barriers is like getting engagement with that sustainability story, if you do a small pilot of a particular intervention, which effectively is likely to be kind of low resource because it will be small, you're then able to kind of garner a whole lot of momentum and sell to internal stakeholders based on a small piloted number of results with clear KPIs that then you can gain kind of more business case, or that can help with your business case, and you can apply for more funding as required to kind of scale it out. And all of these recommendations I'm talking about and all of these kind of methodologies can be applied both kind of internally, but also to your customers and to general kind of citizens of New Zealand. These approaches are used both externally and internally, but I'm just really focused today on the internal, and that can be a whole other webcast to talk about external. But I think it's really useful, and what's great also in terms of selling this methodology and looking for opportunities to show that real behaviour change is there's just so many studies out there which are randomised controlled trials that you can feel really confident that they're robust and that you're able to apply, depending on the context, some of those insights specifically within your organisation and kind of learn from others' randomised controlled trials. Cool. Okay, so I'm now going to talk through some specific examples. Obviously we don't have lots of time, so I'm going to be we've just picked some key ones that we think are really valuable. And I want to quickly have a small caveat there that I am not a sustainable development goals expert. That's for Sophia, so I will pass on any kind of key questions that go into more of the specific metrics specific to those goals, but I'll be focused on the experience that I have in a number of projects that do contribute to those goals. And the first is kind of an obvious one that is focused on really climate action and taking the action to kind of focus on reducing carbon emissions. And here's a study that I did, I think it was about a year ago now, or beginning of last year, when I was living over in the UK. And we worked with an energy company and set up a controlled trial within a company, and we were able to separate the whole building up, and we had an energy measure on one side and a different energy measure on the other side. So it was a really clean, controlled trial where we could compare applying behavioural insights to one part of the building to not any insights to the other side of the building. And here the brief was that the organisation didn't have the resource required to have the best in smart energy technologies within their building. Obviously, it would be best practice just to have the technology within an organisation. That means that you're not relying on employees to make, good choices around the energy use. The building does it for you, but knowing that investments in those technologies can take some time and you might not necessarily be able to make the changes required in your building. This is what you can do in order to just encourage employees to reduce their energy. And so what we did is we focused on ensuring, of course, that all of the defaults and the thermostats and the air conditioning, etc., were actually set at a range that was best practice and not necessarily allowing employees to make big swings up and down in terms of the thermostat, which seems like really small and really obvious, but makes a big difference and something that we can overlook when we're thinking about energy use. We also gave people a sense of feedback. So we're much more likely to make changes if we feel that we've got a sense of progress. And secondly, that someone's going to notice. So someone is going to notice if I do this, and therefore giving people feedback. People go, oh yeah, okay, if I do this in this direction or this direction, someone's going to know. And so what we did is we gave people weekly updates, so the team's kind of weekly updates to show, oh, this is how the energy use this week has gone. Has it gone up or has it gone down? And well done, or do better next week, effectively. We used a bit of social norm. So we had people with little stickers, and we said, I think it was a big smiley face if you turned your monitor off overnight, and a sad face if you had not. Monitors don't use a whole lot of energy, so it's not necessarily one of the big impact ones, but it was a nice kind of contributing factor. So all of the different techniques that we used in the treatment group led to a 26% reduction in energy when compared to the control group. And that was over a month period. And what was great, having that control in that treatment, it means that we couldn't be, you know, couldn't undermine our results by changes in the weather or the etc., because absolutely it was exactly the same time period for the two different groups. The next example is a live example that we have, and we might have a few Auckland Transport people on the call, I'm sure. And we've got a great project on at the moment, recognising that all of these people have adopted great active mode type behaviours during COVID. People are walking more, people are cycling more, etc. And it's been great to see. I think there were some stats that in parts of Auckland, people were walking twice as much as they had before, and a lot more use of shared cycleways, which is, you know, a great result. And what we want is people to kind of stick to those behaviours. Although it's a bit chilly outside, you know, preferably people don't lose all of that great momentum and the nice time they might have walking their kids to school, or enjoying a nice walk with your partner that they might not otherwise have done. So what we've used is a technique called Whoop, and you can look that up, it's great. And effectively what you're looking is for people to make a commitment to a goal, like to have a wish, to articulate the benefits of achieving it, that kind of outcome, identify the actual barriers to them achieving that goal, and visualize overcoming those barriers. It seems a bit comprehensive, but it's pretty simple. It's just kind of 4 questions that you ask people. And we've asked people about their walking and cycling goals, you know, to follow these 4 steps, and we've created a tool that people can fill in. And what we're hoping to see is that by people using this technique, they're going to be a bit more likely to follow through on their goals. And afterwards, we're going to send a few nudges. So using different insights into how we think, we're going to use a number of nudge techniques to encourage people to stick to their goal. And if you'd like to take part, then please email this group here, and we're interested in having a few more participants. And I'm not going to go into too much detail because I can't give away a live experiment, but it's a really nice technique and lots of examples of using this technique called Whoop to encourage people to stick to their goals. And to give you an example of how it's worked in the past, when I was working in the UK, my team there did a huge experiment with British cycling and HSBC. And by using this technique Whoop, the group who thought about their goals and how they were going to overcome them, etc., stuck to their goals 32% more than the group who were just told about the importance of cycling and they made a goal. So 32% is obviously a big gap, and something that maybe you could replicate in your workplace. Thinking about specifically this audience, this internal audience, I spent years and years working in employee engagement and getting people engaged in different projects, and these are some techniques that have proven to be useful. Just keeping an eye on time, okay. So really need to focus on leveraging positive emotions. Guilting people into it absolutely just doesn't work. So where possible, it's about pride and a sense of joy. Social norm, we do things, we're much more likely to do things if other people are doing it too. It's just a tendency that we have, and you'll see lots of examples out there where you focus on what people are already doing and encourage them to jump on board. A quick note there, don't use social norm when what people are doing isn't what you want them to do. So saying, oh, look at what all these guys are doing, isn't that bad? It just encourages people actually to do the thing that you're saying you shouldn't do. So it's best to focus on the positive. Messenger effect, who says it can be more important than what they actually say. So really focusing on credibility, likability, trustworthiness is critical. And leverage a person's sense of identity. So there's a lot of evidence about, again, back to this idea of people having the intention and recognizing the value of sustainability. There's a lot of research to show that if you talk about the identity of a person as opposed to the specific action, and if they want to identify with that type of attribute, then they'll be kind of propelled to act in a way that kind of identity implies. To be a bit more precise about that, there's a lot of research about, say, voting, as opposed to saying, get out and vote. You talk about being a voter. and it's proven to have a marked impact when the language focused on, do you want to be a voter, versus just saying get out and vote. So there's some nice kind of techniques there to think about in your messaging internally to encourage specific behaviours. I'm going to give a quick example. This is a really popular example in sustainability, and I feel I would be lost if I didn't at least share it quickly, and you might have seen this before, but it's a really nice example of how to apply this concept of behavioural science, of social norms, sorry. So when we're thinking about watching water use and how much water people use, there was this fundamental study done by OPower over in the US, and they looked at carefully comparing people to their neighbours and saying, hey, this is your water usage compared to Jane down the street or George up the road. And it seems, you know, like that shouldn't make much difference. It's really simple and I don't really care about my neighbour. Well, people do, it seems. What they found was a huge reduction in people using water when they were compared to their neighbour. And so what we show is if you identify that the group that are, I guess, not as adherent to the desired behaviour, and if they're kind of say 10-20% of the population, if you focus on them being different to the other 90 or 80%, you'll see often that that group will change because they'll be shown to be different to the norm. And we typically just don't like to sway or like move too far away from the pack. And then my last section here is one of the goals is around reducing inequality. So I just have one example and some techniques to consider and encouraging a diverse workplace, and knowing that that can be really hard. But ultimately, I mean, fundamental from a behavioural science perspective is to just not focus on mindsets, but focus on the context that you're providing people. We are just innately likely to be to give into bias, and it's just how we are, and the best thing is to really acknowledge that. And the way that I've seen it described really well before is to not give people the information that they can then create bias out of. So what we're trying to do is create a system that doesn't let people give in to their tendency of bias, because we're just not aware that we're doing it. And there is really conflicting evidence about things such as trying to train this out. And therefore it's better just to work on the systems and the context. And so here's an example here that proves why this is necessary. It's a really unfortunate study done with 1,500 people, where they looked at how likely someone was going to be asked in for an interview based on their name and a photograph of them. And so what they found is if they had exactly the same application, and they randomly, across these 1,500 people, gave this exact same application a different name, and in one case, a different photo. And what they found is, this was undertaken in Germany in 2016, so a little bit old, but I think potentially still really important and relevant, is that when the person had a German name, Sandra, they were asked and called back 19% of the time. If they had a Turkish name, they were invited back 14% of the time. If they had a Turkish name and the photo showed a headscarf, they were invited back 4% of the time. And it just shows you a really stark difference and unfortunately the bias that can occur before someone's even entered the room. So what you want to do preferably is, there's some really simple techniques and tools and systems out there to just try and look at your systems and processes to avoid that kind of thing happening. And here's some examples here, and there's a lot of research out there. I've got one link on this document here, which I'd recommend looking into. And the first thing is using tools to reduce any bias in your advert. So you might unintentionally use certain language that might attract a certain type of applicant, and that certain type of applicant is probably very close to what everyone else in that organisation might already be like, or the background that they might have. So this is often the fact that adverts can have a really kind of masculine language, and therefore there's a tool out there, I've included the link there, to look at how you can just do a double check of the language and that make sure that you're encouraging lots of different types of applicants in the first place. Blind recruitment, so there's tools out there, but there's also the opportunity to do this manually, although time consuming, to take out the name, to take out the school that a person went to, so that you avoid any bias that comes in regards to someone's cultural background, their gender, and any kind of social class. So there's kind of different studies out there. Some have worked really well, some not quite as well, but the premise behind it really stands. If it's done well, it's a great way to just take out that sense, that kind of unconscious association a person might have with a particular type of name. Use skill-based assessments. So preferably you have people do the thing that you want them to do, and therefore you're not just relying on the feeling that you get from someone or the conversations that you've had in person, but you've got kind of hard evidence that's really like objective and that other people can look at and assess equally, just like yourself. And the last thing is, as much as possible, kind of centralizing and ensuring that your interview guides are adhered to avoid any kind of subjective and slightly different approaches that you might get from different interviewers. And that just helps, again, avoid that sense that a person will pick a kind of person that they enjoy or connect with, which is important, but we really want to make sure that everyone has an equal chance. So that's the key things, not too over time, I think, but the core thing is kind of talking through these specific behavioural case studies, giving that methodology and understanding a bit about what behavioural economics is looking to achieve. And here's my contact details. This slide show will be shared afterwards, so you're able to access those. And so if you have questions or projects that you're looking to implement and you think a behavioural lens might be valuable, then please do get in touch. And with that, I will pass back over.
Thank you so much, Thea. That was so insightful. And yeah, all those studies are just, I think it's really great to see the results, to see the science that backs it. You know, as someone from a science background, it's really important to see the evidence. And I think being able to show business leaders facts often does create important business cases. Obviously, the one about the diversity in job applicants, I just feel like it's really important that you have shared that in the timely context of the Black Lives Matter movement. And it's just another example of how like depressing the situation is, quite frankly. And I think it's really important to stress that sustainability isn't just about looking after the environment and reducing our emissions. It's actually about respecting and supporting each other as people, and that's like fundamental to achieving a sustainable future. So I think we've got some questions coming in. There was one earlier. I'll just dive into a few of them that have come in. The one that came in just after my presentation says, an earlier graph showed CO2 emission growth over the past century. After the global economic crisis, there was a dramatic spike upwards in emissions. Do we understand exactly why this was and how we can prevent that occurring again? If I think back to the graph that I did show, I'm not exactly sure why, but I'm pretty sure it's because after like the global economic crisis, the way to stimulate the economy again was just to go back to business as usual and to invest in very fossil fuel heavy industries. And so in order to not do that again, we need to make sure that we have alternative economic stimulus in the shape of something like a Green New Deal, where the jobs that we are supporting and the industries we're supporting are actually aligned to our sustainable, to the Sustainable Development Goals, but also our carbon neutral ambitions. So hopefully that answers the question, but I don't physically understand why. If anyone in the attendees does know why, feel free to answer the question in the Q&A box. The next question that came in said, regarding the example you provided about reducing energy use in an office, what are the long-term effects of those nudges? How long did these energy savings last for? And do the nudges need to continue consistently in order to maintain the positive change? That's a really good question, thank you.
Nice. Yeah, exactly. Really great question. What we were in effect looking to do there was to encourage new behaviours and new habits. So what we want to do is encourage people to see the benefit of adopting the new habit, which in this case was reducing their energy use. And then by repeatedly undertaking that action, they'd create a habit, and then that would be able to sustain in the longer term, even without those consistent nudges. It's a really good question. I think as an external consultant, I don't always have kind of the longer term visibility of some of the impacts. And in this case, I'm not working with that company anymore, so I can't actually answer kind of the really long-term impact. But I think that it will have had some lasting impact in terms of those new habits. And I think it's useful to share kind of the timing around that. There isn't actually any evidence that says specifically in all contexts, here's the rule in terms of how long a nudge needs to be in place, or how long a person is required to, how long they need to create a new habit. Because it's very dependent on how difficult the action is and the specific context. These actions were pretty simple, and therefore we thought that around a month was a good amount of time. If it was something that was a bit more comprehensive and complex, we might have given it a little bit more time. But yeah, really great question. And I think another thing to mention is nudges themselves aren't designed necessarily. People would get used to them if they were repeated over and over again and you saw the same thing. It wouldn't have the same lasting impact. So if we went back in there after 6 months and we'd seen a bit of fade in people's behaviours, we might have tried a slightly different approach just to encourage and look at a new way to keep those habits going.
That feeds quite nicely into the next question, which was, do people respond to nudges when they know they're being nudged? Another good question.
I think that there's something about, it's the same in a sense that if I receive a message from a company that's encouraging me to, say, purchase their phone, I know they want me to purchase the phone. I'm then going to look at the attributes of the phone and decide whether I want to buy the phone. The fact that I know they want me to buy the phone isn't necessarily going to mean that I'm not going to, because I understand that that's their job as the phone company. So I think that fundamental to behavioural science is a recognition that we're often just encouraging people to do what they otherwise would want to do. The idea is that because of the intention action gap, you've got all these phenomenal opportunities and ideas and policies, and that the governments and the general populace all agree are a great idea, such as reducing carbon emissions. It's just people find it really hard in the moment to actually do the thing required. So where the ethics of this area are typically focused on how do we encourage people to follow through on what they is typically people would agree is in their best interest. And therefore we wouldn't necessarily see people a lot of the time kind of having their back up or defensive about the fact they're being nudged necessarily. I've not seen lots of evidence of that. So yeah.
Really helpful. The next question, another really good question. Funding for interventions tends to be about the delivery rather than taking the time and researching the interventions first. Mm-hmm. What advice would you give to managers to advocate for a more detailed approach?
What advice would you give to managers for advocate a more detailed approach
to the interventions? Nice. Do you want me to repeat the question? Or?
That's okay, I can read that here.
Yeah, sorry.
No, not at all, not at all. Yeah, really good point. It's just often last minute, we have to do this thing now, fix it. And it's, sometimes so quick, and it's really difficult, I found internally, to have the space to find the best possible intervention. So I think that those kind of stakeholder relationships, I can imagine it's a case of preparations to see when those type of situations occur. So having in your back pocket some of the reports that are out there really focused on behavioural science and sustainability, and in a sense teaching stakeholders that they should be expecting measurable results. And for them to expect those measurable results, they are required to give you some time to be able to design the best possible intervention. And I would say there's so many evidence out there that, you know, preferably you do have an expert to help you wade through it all, because you have to apply these things very carefully. But in terms of the business case in the first place, there's so much evidence out there that can really bolster your business case, that hopefully it wouldn't take too much time to identify a few studies that would just help improve what you're selling in. But I think, yeah, probably a bit of preparation, teaching the stakeholders what they can get, but what is then required of them. And I think that more and more there'll be an expectation of that evidence before anything is undertaken in the first place.
Thanks for answering that, Thea. I'm just conscious of time. Are you happy to overrun for another like 5 or so minutes, and we'll answer some of these questions? There are quite a few questions coming through, and I don't think we'll make through all of them. So perhaps the ones we don't get through, we can answer in the follow-up newsletter.
Nice, sounds great.
Yeah. Are you happy to continue for another 5 minutes or so, Thea? Awesome.
Great.
Are there any questions in particular that you're seeing that you'd like to address? I think all of them addressed to the behaviour change.
Nice, that's great. That's okay if you don't mind reading them out, and then people can hear them. And I might just look a bit strange staring at the screen trying to read them.
Okay.
About my answer.
I'm just going to go through each one. So this was a question related to the O-Powers case study. So do you know of any example of O-Powers neighbours approach being applied to travel behaviour or mode shift?
Ooh, nice. Good question. I mean, it's applied. I think that might be a little social norm for sure will be used. So there'll be a discussion about, we're even saying, we're talking about in our communications encouraging people to take part in our trial, the fact that twice the amount of people than normal were walking and cycling during COVID, which is a related type of application of that insight. So there's likely to be examples where people talk about the number of people that are cycling or walking in a specific area, but I haven't seen specifically how that would be applied in a geographical area. One really interesting, it's not sustainability, but I think is a really interesting application of that insight, is a well-known study over in the UK where they were looking to reduce antibiotic prescriptions, and they went out and they plastered marketing everywhere around the offices of doctors' surgeries and said, it's really dangerous, you shouldn't be overprescribing antibiotics, make sure that you reduce your prescriptions, this is bad. That led to an increase in people prescribing antibiotics, because all it did was that priming of seeing this constant antibiotic marketing, and actually unconscious, it just meant that people were more likely to think about antibiotics. Instead, they sent a letter out from the chief medical officer, they then tried, this letter out from the chief medical officer just to the top 10% of prescribers. And they said, you are in the top 10% of prescribers in the UK. Please consider your approach and look for opportunities to reduce your antibiotic prescriptions. And that led to, I think, over 4%, which is huge when you think about that particular context. A really big impact in the numbers of prescriptions, which is great.
That is really insightful. I keep thinking about how this could be applied to, in businesses of encouraging employees to drive and not to drive, to cycle and walk. So imagine if you emailed the top drivers, but I guess you'd have to get all that data as well.
You'd have to get them to admit to it, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
Unless they're allowing, there's apps that can kind of measure how much driving you do, for example, if you allowed the app to do that, and then give you feedback on how much you were driving, for example, and the opportunity to reduce that feedback on you, and then comparing anyone else who's as part of that is also on the app would be one opportunity.
Yeah. We'll just have one last question. This one is, do we need to consider demographic differences, value differences, like green consciousness and time value, etc., of the customers when using nudges for behavioural change, or is it one strategy fits all? A really, really good question.
Right. Yeah, that's great. I think if you have the capability and the time and resource to be able to target based on specific segments, then that's absolutely the best approach. So we have had experience at PwC where with, I think it was an energy utility, they were able to test different nudges with different market segments, and then they applied those, they did that in a pilot environment, and then based on certain variables were able to then have their scaled approach, meant that different audiences received different nudges, which is a kind of a best practice and a great opportunity. There isn't necessarily lots of evidence that you could immediately apply and say, for example, women between 28 and 35 are more likely to care about loss aversion, one of the principles. And that's something that could come down the line, but at this stage isn't immediately accessible. So it would require actual testing, which is a great opportunity for you. So it might be that you do a small online test where you test different messages, and you'd have a bigger audience because you then want to segment by whatever audience variable you have. So if you've already got data on how pro-social someone is and some kind of metric, then you could test, say, 3 different types of behavioural science messages and then test them with different groups based on that pro-social metric. So you just need a bigger sample size. And then if you were doing that in a pilot, you could then scale that out to the wider audience based on the insights that you found. I'd say this is great and would be a definite opportunity, because obviously if you're very pro-social, pro-environmental, then your lens is going to be a little bit different. But if you're just still getting used to this, applying this methodology, I'd just start with, I wouldn't probably complicate it immediately.
It's probably worthwhile thinking about that, leveraging a sense of identity and thinking of your target audience who you're really trying to nudge identifies as, maybe has negative connotations of what you're trying to nudge them towards. You have to think of how you can frame that in like a different, in a different way that makes them want to choose to be to take that action. I'm going to wrap it up there. This has been an awesome webinar. Thank you so much, Thea, for sharing all of your insights, and thank you everyone that attended and has posted some amazing questions. There are still quite a few there, so we will answer them in the newsletter, and if you do have a question that you haven't put in yet, feel free to do that and we'll do our best to respond to them, probably in more in like a themed approach in the newsletter. So with that, we'll just say goodbye. Thanks again, Thea, and yeah, thank you everyone for coming.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Well, thanks to both of our experts, Thea and Sophia, for providing all that great content and all of those examples. So just a reminder, everyone, that in the next couple of days, I'll be following up with an email to you, which will have the recording, the PDF of the slides, and a survey as well. So very much encourage everyone to fill out the survey. That's how we get our feedback and help us to focus on what problems we need to talk about next. And as Sophia and Thea also mentioned, those last couple of questions that we'll try and answer briefly in that as well. So any other issues or concerns, please feel free to also give me an email back. And we just want to thank you all for attending.